Hello everybody, I'm Mr. Cheebs, and today we are going to be cutting things in half inside of Blender. I've done videos on the subject before, but that was just surface level slashing with dynamic paint. Today we're actually taking an object and splitting it in half with a knife. So, let's get started. So the first thing we need is something to cut. I'm just going to use a fruit, specifically this banana from CG Trader. Now, why would you cut a banana in half instead of just peeling it? I don't know, but that's not important right now. If we're going to cut this, we need some extra models to split it into, because like most 3D trickery, we aren't simulating an actual cut, just using some smoke and mirrors to look like we're cutting this thing in half. To get a clean cut, I'd recommend using booleans. There are other ways to cleanly split a mesh, but I find that booleans are pretty quick, pretty easy, and since they were improved in Blender 2.91, they're pretty stable too. Make a copy of the object you want to cut and create a thin cube to slice through it. Now add a boolean operation to the first object with the type set to difference and select your thin cube. Now this should take a small slice out of the middle of your mesh. Apply the boolean and head to edit mode. Here we're going to select a face on one half of the mesh and hit Ctrl L to select all faces that are linked to it. Now we can hit the P key and click Selection to separate our selected half into a different object. Now if you have a material on your object that's working with UV coordinates, this should work fine and the two halves should be okay. Procedural textures may not work as well, so I'd recommend baking your materials to textures if you're using things like noise nodes and whatnot. Also, now would probably be a good time to assign something to the inside edges of our halves, so that it's not all wonky inside of there. If you just grab that single interior face and unwrap that instead of the whole mesh, your UV coordinate should be fine, and then you can just use some nodes to mix between textures there. I'm going to go grab a picture of the inside of a banana, and we'll be right back. Make sure you do this as a different material for both halves and keep it separate from the material for your whole uncut object. Let's add a knife into our scene and animate it chopping through our object at the split point. All that's left now to get a sorta complete effect is some shader magic. Go to the node network for your whole object. We're going to blend between a transparent shader and the regular material based off of the position of the knife, and that will make our original object disappear as the knife chops through it. Add in a mix shader and a transparent BSDF node and connect that up. Then add in a texture coordinate node, a mapping node, a gradient texture, and a color ramp, and create a little node tree out of those before plugging it into the factor for the mix shader. Now would be a good time to note that you'll have to set the blend mode of the material to alpha hashed or alpha blend if you are using Eevee to render this effect. Also, I'd recommend enabling the Node Wrangler plugin. That way we can hit Ctrl Shift and click a node to see what the output of that node looks like. To make this gradient move with the knife, we're going to select it under the texture coordinates object selection, and then we're going to use the object output from the texture coordinate node to feed into the mapping node. We can see that it's currently vertical instead of horizontal, so we'll need to rotate that by 90 degrees in the mapping node. We also want to edit this gradient a bit so that it syncs up with the sharp edge of the knife, so let's change the location to do that. Just pick a frame and make sure that it lines up at the bottom, and then it should be good for the rest of the animation. It's not bad, but the output is kind of soft, and as we know, knives don't really cut in a gradient like this, and that's why we have our color ramp. If we look at the output of that node with Ctrl Shift, we can drag the sliders closer together to create a more hard edge. Adjust the mapping node at this point if you need to. And finally, use Ctrl Shift back on the mix shader to plug that back into the material output. If your object is appearing instead of disappearing as the knife moves through it, then you'll want to swap the basic material and the transparent BSDF in the mix shader. If you wanted the basic effect, then there you go. But if you want to know how to add a bunch of other stuff, then hang around and I'll show you how to make this a bit better. I am going to continue with this banana, so most of the improvements will be specific to the context of chopping something on a cutting board. Now the first thing we can do is a bit better animation. Check out some reference, maybe cook something, and see how things actually react when they're being chopped. If we take that and spend more time on the animation, this will get a lot better. A rigid body simulation for some of the pieces is always helpful too, and makes this a bit more convincing. If you do additional animation on the knife like this, you might find that parts of your original banana appear again, and that simply won't do. We can fix it pretty quickly by just animating the location value after the initial cut of the knife though on our mapping node. Just use the I key, plop down some keyframes, and make sure to increase that value by a ton as soon as the knife hits the cutting board. Now we need some effects. An idea I had was to use dynamic paint to affect the roughness of the knife, but I found that it worked just as well to manually paint the texture and keyframe the mix factor over a couple of frames. When I chopped a banana with a knife in my own kitchen, not much residue was actually left, and the dynamic paint effect wouldn't have been able to replicate it all that well. However, if you're doing something juicy, or if you're, chopping an arm off or something, then you could add in some dynamic paint and maybe a fluid simulation as well. To finish off this scene in particular, I wrapped up the environment and used the amazing technique of just blurring everything that doesn't look good with some extreme depth of field. A bit of camera shake, some post-processing, and we are finished. Now, soft objects are a whole different ballpark, so I may or may not look at those in the future depending on how time-consuming and hard they are. If you want to get the project file for this, that'll be up on my Patreon, and you can support the channel there too. It would be much appreciated. I want to thank Matt, Terry Davis, Susan Uncle, Stephen D. Swanee, Atomic Alf, Justin Oliver, and Don Hopkins for helping me out over there. And I want to thank all you guys for watching this. Go ahead and have a great day.